All right, I will say, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar titled Beyond the Logical Mind, Creating Inclusive Systems with Diverse Data. My name is Hermes Huang. I am one of the co-founders and managing partners at Insight Pact. And I myself am a facilitator working with partners and clients across Asia and the Pacific and around the world, both virtually and in person, um, in lots of parts of my day. It's great to have you all here. I'm based in Bangkok myself, but I know that we have people joining us from all across Asia. I'm joined here today by my colleague and friend and partner in work, Beth, who is the executive director of Future Considerations. She's also CPO at Biocellian, and she has more than 25 years as a technical leader in fast-moving consumer goods, textiles, and apparel industries. She also has more than 10 years as a coach and facilitator working with executives around the world. Um, she has many different certifications across spiral dynamics, systemic constellations, emotional intelligence, somatic training, and she has also been doing martial arts training for over 8 years now. It's really, really great to have you here, Beth. I'm going to throw the floor over to you in just a few moments to give much more elaborate and heartfelt introduction for yourself. But I wanted to go ahead and set the scene a little bit today as we jump into today's topic. If I could distill our topic from our webinar title today, it is primarily concerned with leadership. So we used a lot of words in the webinar for today, but primarily we're going to be talking about what kind of leaders do we want to be in the future? And that's primarily around these two concepts of systems and diverse data, which we are going to attempt in the next hour to unpack a little bit more for you and also give you clear and concrete pathways for you to be able to take these concepts and continue the conversation with us or go find resources and dive deeper into some of the resources that we'll provide you today. So I'm going to start by actually talking a little bit about the concepts of diverse data and systems, either systems design or systems inquiry, which we'll talk both about today as well. So when I talk about diverse data, which we'll go into a little bit deeper, we're talking about data that goes beyond maybe what you already know when you think about data, which maybe from the quantitative side, we're thinking about numbers, and the qualitative side, where we're talking about notes that you might be taking down and surveys where people get free responses. When we talk about diverse data, we're also talking about how individuals, such as managers and leaders, also take in environmental stimulus or internal changes in one's physiology in response to a context. For example, the way that your heart rate changes when you are in contexts that are exciting or nerve-wracking or terrifying or joyful, or the way that raindrops feel on your body and how that brings up emotions and physiological responses to changes in our environment as we move through the world and interact with the people and the places around us. That's just the start of our conversation in terms of the definition. You may have a different definition when you hear diverse data or a different reaction, or you might have pushback on the definition that I just gave here. Now, when we talk about systems, we're talking about the fact that we essentially exist, not in isolation as individuals, but in relation to each other, in relation to the processes, the objects, the places that we work and live in. And the idea with systems inquiry and systems design is by expanding our view and our capability to see the larger system, we're able to then understand the possibilities that we have to shift or to inquire or to adjust our own behavior individually and within our teams or within our other interpersonal in relationships to make decisions. Okay, I've just talked a lot here. I just wanted to give you a chance to sort of start to absorb what is a lot of very complex topics to unpack. But we're going to give you a chance to pause from that for a moment. And I'm actually going to throw it over to Beth for a moment because she has this great background and that has spanned from a background in science and working in facilitation and coaching, and in fast-moving consumer goods. And I'd love to hear from your own words, Beth, a little bit more about your own journey to where you are now in the work that you do.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have lots of weight here, so I have a very long journey. And when I started my professional journey, it was actually from an interest in the arts. I was fascinated by an art movement in Germany called Bauhaus. You may have heard of some people like Joseph Albers or Paul Klee or other people. Mies van der Rohe, the architect, they were part of the Bauhaus movement. And they really made me excited because of the very different way that they were approaching the space of design. So I was intent on becoming a designer, and in particular, a textile designer. But when I got to school to study textile design, I found myself incredibly bored. So I invented a new curriculum, and I had a dean who was very accommodating and let me do just that, make a new curriculum. And so that new curriculum was the intersection of aesthetic design, of structural design like architecture, and engineering. So I put those things together. And I think that kind of started me off in this approach to whole systems thinking and to trying to look at things from differing points of view. And when you mentioned diverse data, for me, diverse data is both looking at how do we as organisms collect data from different places, but also how do we as teams and as institutions make space for diverse disciplines so that we can bring all those points of view into one space. So I took that approach and went into research and development at Johnson & Johnson, and then further expanded that approach when I started to work in the field of organizational development. And now I found myself full circle as part of a computational biology startup, where I'm back into the space where we have to bring biology, engineering, mathematics, and organizational systems together to create a successful entity. So that's kind of my journey from that beginning point of let's look at lots of different ways of looking at this issue.
Thanks so much, Beth, for that introduction. It's really, really great to hear. I mean, I also wanted to take a moment to share a little bit about our relationship as well, and how I've learned a lot from Beth moving into and developing my own understanding of this concept of diverse data. And that actually began with my own practice in design, and trying to understand and practicing design with clients, with partners, my own projects, um, in a way that allowed me to be more co-creative. My career started in international development, where there are a lot of different stakeholders and there's a lot of different power dynamics, between people who hold money, who hold agency, who hold decision-making power, and then on top of that, the rhetoric of benefiting someone else, of helping someone else. And so a lot of my early explorations around design was more around how can we co-create much better. And what I was finding early on, and still to this day actually, is that it's sometimes really difficult to get people to spend money on the moments that allow us to engross ourselves in environments and in interactions and to develop relationships with the people that we want to either design for or with. So, what this practically means is, let's say we're developing a new food product that requires a specific ingredient. Like, ideally, I would be able to go directly to the source and understand how the farmer that grows the original crop or ingredient that we need, uh, it would allow me to spend some money to go out and to be in that environment, talk to the farmers, and to understand how their culture is in that space and what is the actual environment. Um, and I was getting frustrated because we were failing to be able to secure the resources to work with our clients in a way that allowed them to also experience direct conversations with stakeholders, customers, etc. And when I first met Beth, she was describing to me a systems thinking in a technique in an embodied way. And she showed me this methodology called systemic constellations, which, if anyone is curious, please put it in the chat, and I'm happy to explain more about it later in our conversation as well. But it is essentially, for those of you who might know this term, stakeholder mapping, if you are in nonprofit world or the international development world, it's a way to do stakeholder mapping where you're identifying lots of different players or stakeholders or actors in a environment or a context and being able to identify how you see them arranged and to then literally step in to the position and perspective that you see that particular perspective in that system. Maybe it's actually better if I stand up and actually show you a little bit just to understand. So, for example, the way that I might do this is that I would maybe take a couple of pieces of paper. I don't have any paper on me right now, but I would write down a bunch of different stakeholders. It might be myself, it might be farmer, it might be the farm itself. And I would place those into a map on the ground. And I would literally stand up and step into the system in the way that I see the different stakeholders arranged with each other. And that actually allows me as a designer, as a person observing the system, to check my own assumptions, to slow down, and to understand and see how my own assumptions in my head about how different stakeholders are arranged actually play out in a different way. And that actually made a big difference in my own practice because it allowed me to offer clients and partners to um, an alternative methodology to going out to the field or to bring customers into the office because all we needed was some paper and some pens. And while it's not a perfect replacement for a field study or direct consumer engagement or stakeholder engagement, it was a way that I could convince partners to slow down and check their assumptions using their own bodies and getting out of their heads to do so and to open it up. And so this was a methodology that I started with Beth, actually got trained with Beth. We were able to do some training together. And then now I've used it with different partners in the United Nations, with different development partners such as GIZ, the Development Corporation, and with a variety of other different clients and partners as well. And it's surprising that when you're able to create an easy, accessible way for people to step out of their heads and into their bodies and their spaces, how much it opens perspectives on what different stakeholders or actors might be, the way that they're placed in our own minds and how that we can shift our own decision making based off of an opportunity to just simply slow down. I don't know, Beth, what's your take on this listening to me? I saw you nodding a little bit. You're oftentimes more eloquent than I am in explaining some of these methods. So maybe there's some reactions and responses or clarifications that you can make for our audience based off of what you're hearing from me as well.
Yeah, I think there are probably many people in the room who went to graduate school and at some point um, went to a course in strategic planning. And they were asked to create stakeholder maps or analyses, just like the one that you've described. And I had that experience myself. Um, at one point in my career, I was studying at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I found when I was trying to do this strategic analysis is I felt really constrained by writing it down, even making a diagram on the sheet of paper. It just felt like it was hemming me in, and I wasn't getting the entire picture. So at that point in time, the first thing that I did is I was trying to represent the complexity of my corporation, Johnson and Johnson. And what I did is I made a three-dimensional mobile that had translucent or transparent parts to it because I wanted to show overlap. So what I was doing is seeing if I could go from just data and facts to something that had another aspect to it, that there was some other intelligence that I was drawing on to help me to understand what was going on. And what you've just described in the foundation of systemic constellations is a system that says we have more intelligence than just facts and data. We also can have an understanding of what's going on emotionally in a system. We can understand the mood of an environment and the emotions of individuals. We also have lots of senses as human beings. We're kind of over-equipped. Most of us grew up thinking that there are 5 senses, but recently scientists are telling us we actually have up to 30 senses as human beings that give us information about what's going on in the world. So what we want is tools and approaches as leaders that allow us to use all of those senses. And then there's my pet peeve. And my pet peeve as a scientist is that one of the most powerful resources that we have as human beings is our intuition. And as scientists, we're very often kind of, people try to train us out of paying attention to our intuition. And I thought that seemed really strange. And as I researched very powerful scientists of the past, what I found out is almost all of them talk about how important intuition has been in their being able to understand what's going on in some kind of system, how to inquire into that system. They needed to tap into the integrating power that is human intuition. So I think that's really what we're talking about when we talk about diverse data, is how do we integrate all of those things into our understanding? And there's lots of different methodologies, systems constellations being a really powerful one, but we have other ways that we can, either as facilitators and consultants and as leaders, help ourselves and our organizations to understand what's going on around us.
Thanks so much, Beth. I actually, before we continue our conversation, what I would actually like to do is to throw it back to our audience here. We've thrown a lot of words at you. We've thrown a lot of concept, a lot of definition, and a lot of anecdote at you. I would love to actually have everyone take a moment to do what we like to call a chatterfall at Insight Pact, which is that I will put a prompt into the chat box here, which will be very simple this time around, which is what is sticking out for you from the conversation so far. Um, and what I'd like you to do is to open up that chat box and take 30 seconds to simply write down a phrase, a sentence in the chat, but don't press enter yet. So we're going to give everyone a chance to think for these 15 to 30 seconds. So go ahead, stick your answer into the chat box here, and don't press enter yet. I will give you a cue when we are ready to enter in all of the responses. You might also ask a question, right? So a word, a phrase, a reaction, a response, a question, anything that is sticking out for you so far from the conversation. Okay, remember, don't press enter yet. We'll just give everyone a chance to think. Okay, and in 3, 2, 1, go ahead and press enter. Okay, and so this is why we call it a chatterfall, because you get this waterfall of chat answers coming in. So go ahead and take a moment and actually see what your colleagues here in the room are writing, so that you can also see and gain awareness of what's sticking out for people throughout this conversation. I see from Romano that he's surprised that we have over 30 senses, from Adi about the intuition and his own reaction and reflection to that. With Juan, a question about hearing tangible activities and actions that we can do in daily life um, to around the topics that we're discussing. Um, David, a question and a curiosity around the how vital the role of intuition plays in organizational development. Fantastic. Beth, what are you thinking when you see these responses coming through? Anything that sticks out to you that you'd like to dive a little deeper into?
Well, yeah, I really like Juan's question about tangible activities and actions that we can do. Because I'm all about how can we do small experiments to move ourselves forward. So I think there's a number of things that we can do. Starting with developing more awareness of our body. And when we Hermes often talks about embodied work. So he's talking about us being aware of what's going on in our body and being aware of the posture and position of ourselves in relation to others. And just noticing everything that's happening to us as a result of our body. So the more that we pay attention to our body and we start noticing kind of the relationship between the form or shape we take and what's going on around us, we can start to develop what's required to do this kind of work. So that's one really tangible thing that we can do. Another really tangible thing that we can do is to kind of try to let go of being so adult and to go back to play. Because when we were children, we already did a lot of this. So we would play at being in other people's shoes, or we would play in being the ogre or the knight or the princess. So we would shift position and we try to kind of feel into what it was like to be in that space. So if we can return to those skills that we developed as children, that's really fabulous. And you can do that very easily, practically, pragmatically, by using just the stuff on your desk. You know, you can turn your phone into your boss and your mouse into your colleague, and you can move them around on the top of your desk and kind of ask yourself, so I wonder how they're feeling when I move them closer together or further apart, or when they're looking away from each other or looking at each other. So we can use those skills that we developed as children, and we can use them to give us some more insight into our current situations. So that would be just a couple of practical things that I would say first off. And what struck you, Hermes? What stood out for you in the Chatterfall?
Looking through this, I mean, I see definitely people bringing up the idea around intuition. It's clear that what you were speaking about with intuition has struck a chord with a few of our audience members here. And so then with that, I want to actually go into David's question here is how vital is the role, or how vital is the what is yeah, how vital is the role of intuition in organizational development. And when it comes back to the practice or the of leadership, the expression of one's leadership in an organization, it has a huge impact because if the leaders or the managers in an organization are processing or synthesizing or integrating information that is either incomplete or only partially available, or if a manager might be lacking all the data that they need, then of course decisions may not be able to address as many people in a positive way for the organization or for teams within the organization as as beneficially as possible. Um, but of course, it's also understanding how not only do leaders have that integrating power, but also all the other individuals in the organization might be able to utilize the data that's available to them to also make decisions around them. That's one thing that's coming up for me, Beth. Um,
So I noticed somebody also put in here, it was like a question, and it was emotional data question mark. Could you say more about that? It's Pautai. Can you come off mute and tell us more about that?
Yes. So I just wondering about the data. That normally we use fact data and then we analyze, but how can we analyze the emotional data if this exists, and how can we apply to this the situation?
That's a really beautiful question. So, and it's a huge subject, so let me try to make it a little bit smaller. A few years ago, we met an Olympic coach who was trying to support athletes to be better competitors for the Olympics. And one of the things that he did is he started to get them to pay very close attention to their emotions. And he had them try to work on expanding their emotional vocabulary, first of all, so that they could make very fine distinctions between how they were feeling. So in an engineering sense, that's like, how finely could we measure something? Like if we use a meter stick, that's very crude. But if we use a tool where we're using an electron microscope, we can measure something very, very tiny. So we can have much more resolution. So he wanted these athletes to have more resolution around their emotion. So that's the first thing he did. And then the second thing he did is he asked them to think about how were those emotions associated with their success or failure. So what they started to discover is things like, sometimes athletes said, oh, I was super confident. And that feels like a very positive emotion. But when they examined the relationship between that positive emotion and their performance, what they recognized is that super confidence caused them to slacken up on the training and to not pay very much attention to what was going on. So what seemed like a positive emotion was actually having a negative impact on their performance. So what this guy, Yuri Hanen is his name, he's a researcher and you can find papers he's published. What he was doing is saying, let's look at what kinds of data emotions give us. And he was doing that in a very scientific and thorough way. But we can do that ourselves in an everyday way. We can be paying attention to what kinds of exchanges cause us to have what we call resourceful emotions emotions that allow us to address something in a way that's useful, and unresourceful emotions or moods, which are things that take us away. So really good examples of that are very often anxiety is something that makes us unresourceful. And if I'm a leader in an organization, I want to be paying attention to my organization and noticing if there's a mood of anxiety, because that's going to shut down the resourcefulness of the organizational system. So I want to be paying attention to emotion and mood, which is related to emotion, in order to be able to better manage and better respond to what's going on in an organizational system. Does that make sense to you?
Thank you so much. This will make sense to me.
Great. Okay.
Thanks so much,
What else?
Beth. Well, I wanted to actually expand on that just a little bit, Beth, and bring it back to this question of like, what are practical, tangible activities that one might be able to do? Is there something that allows individuals to be able to take that first step to understand how they might respond or react within a professional context?
Yeah, there's, well, some of the things we've already mentioned. So we talked about like paying attention to your body and what's going on to your physiologic state. So kind of noticing where your breath is. Is your breath up in your chest? When our breath is up in our chest, it normally means that we need a lot of oxygen in our head. We're breathing shallowly, and so we're breathing quickly to oxygenate, right? Or is our breath coming down from our gut? And when we're doing that, then we're kind of getting more toward theta wave state, right? So we're calming down and we're able to deal with what's going on in a different way. So just developing that awareness of breath is a really great way to start. If we want to think about this in a more kind of academic and how do we map how we are, there's a really great tool that comes from an organization called Leadership Circle. And Leadership Circle offers this self-assessment. It's free. Thank you very much. Okay. And what it does is it helps us to take a look at what we call creative responses. So those are those responses that are, I would call them resourceful, and then reactive responses, which are responses which may be a little bit less resourceful, may be resourceful in particular conditions, but aren't as good as when we don't have that. So that tool is really brilliant at kind of getting you to think about, as a leader, what's the whole scope of things that might be contributing to your success. And what I would recommend is, if you're working on a team and you don't have a lot of money, you can just all do the self-assessment and share it with each other, because it's free. If you have some resources in your organization, you can actually do the 360, but that's not free anymore. It's pretty expensive. But it's also quite powerful. So that's another thing that you can do if you want to. You can start to think about how you think about organizational systems. So Hermes and I were having a discussion earlier about what happens when we think about a system as almost being something that's engineered, so that we can design it, we can fix it, we can re-engineer it, we can, right? So there's value in doing that, because that's a very systematic, very database approach that we can take to looking at a system. But on the other hand, we could say, well, what if I step back and I looked at my organization as more of an organism? How would I think about it differently if I thought about it as something which was a living system? So if it's a living system, then I might start to look at these diverse data sources. of the living system. And I want to think about, oh, so how can I notice the emotions of this organic structure? Where's the intuition of this system? How does this system actually sense things? What does it have available to it to kind of understand what's going on? So I think if you just kind of examine your metaphors, that's a really practical, simple, easy thing that you can do to start thinking about, how does my thinking about the system impact the solutions that I put in place? So I had a professor way back in the dark ages at the University of Pennsylvania who said, we solve the problems for which we have the tools. So that's why my life is, I don't ever want to stop learning, because I want to be able to constantly think about what other way is there to look at this problem. So that's another thing you can do, is just keep looking for ways that you can expand your tool set so that you don't just have a hammer. You have lots of other tools that you can be using to bring to the organizational challenges that you're working on.
Tools that not only help you inquire, but also help you sort of integrate the information that you have. It's not just, there's a whole range of different functions of tools that you want to be able to have in your pocket, to be able to, and you can start anywhere. You're only starting from, if we imagine that if we're always a part of a system, then we can only really begin with ourselves and the perspective that we take in any given moment from that place that we are in the system. Absolutely.
But it's really helpful to examine it, to see if we can step back and look at it, get some information from other people about what that looks like. And there is a paper, by the way, about the leadership circle that was applied with scientists in Indonesia. And we can make that paper available to people if they're interested to see what impact it had on them. Those scientists were working specifically on how to improve their capacity to collaborate.
Absolutely. I think that we could definitely send that out to the participants and registrants of this webinar afterwards as well. Okay, at this point, I want to make sure that we're also opening up the floor for additional questions. So we had that little opportunity for you to just see what's rising to the top, but I also want to make sure that you get a chance to speak up if you'd like, more than just thinking for 15 to 30 seconds. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or to type another question into the chat, and come onto the floor. Patrick, your hand's raised. Come on.
Hi, Beth. Nice to reconnect with you. My question is, well, firstly, I just want to say I love the uh I love the suggestion you made on returning to your childhood and basically being a child again in order to make sense of data. I wondered, from your perspective, what are the values that we lost while growing up, and what are the values that we need to regain that we had from being children in order to have this relationship with data that you're speaking of? So I'll stop there.
That's a really lovely question, Patrick. So the first thing that I think many of us have at least pushed aside from childhood is our burning curiosity. So that's the first thing, is to be curious. And the second thing is that sense of playfulness, that we don't have to get it right the first time. We can try something and see what happens. We can try something that maybe is a little off the wall. So that kind of sense of, I don't have to worry about my face. I don't have to worry about my expertise. I don't have to worry about it being right. That I have some space to experiment, to play, to get curious, to look at things from different angles. I think that's what we want to bring back from our childhood that we may have left behind. Many of us haven't, we still have it, but a lot of us have kind of let it fall by the way a little.
Thanks so much for that question, Patrick. Anybody else? Any curiosities, any clarifications? Again, a lot of the stuff that we've been saying is pretty dense. So there are no wrong questions here. And if there's something that you want us to repeat or to say with different words, like please speak up and let us know, because it will 100% benefit more than just you to share those questions.
So Ivy, I noticed you said it would be great if you can see a real life case. Did you say, oh, there, Romano, you have a question, sorry. And then maybe we can come back to Adi.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you first for a lot of great conversation and information. And I think this question might also get to Adi's question a little bit. Through your experience, I think both Beth, for you and for Hermes, through your experience, both with trying to encourage more of a sense of play, as well as encourage more embodied ways of thinking and embracing diverse data. What has the reception been like from various sectors around the world, not just in Asia? Government, private sector, Fortune 500, small enterprises, wherever it may be. Is there typically people welcome you with open arms and are very excited to take off their shoes and do something new, or is it a lot more?
So, Hermes, you want me to go first? Do you want to go next?
Go ahead. Yeah, I definitely have some things to answer, but I go ahead.
So first of all, I think a lot of it has to do with the energy that you bring into the room when you bring these ideas. And I've experienced very little resistance. So I have had people crawling around on the floor, people all around the world building stuff out of Legos, people talking to each other with puppets, people creating plays to talk about really serious issues in the organization. I've had people learn how to listen to each other by learning how to sing complex medieval songs. I think that if you come in with the energy that this is a natural part of life and of being human, that people generally are quite accepting. I can remember once going to have a conversation with what I thought would be the most conservative organization on the face of the earth, a very large bank in London, and they said, this is nothing. We do stuff much crazier than this, because as bankers, we have to get out of our heads. We have to get out of the rules. We have to do something else or we're going to die. So I think there's a big appetite for this kind of work. Hermes?
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely, the pushback that I have received with clients oftentimes is because the client contact is actually is the one that's more worried than the actual participants of the workshop. So much of it is also just making sure that you have trust in your own methodologies and as Beth said, to also approach. But it is to also understand that people do want to do something different when they're given the opportunity to do so, especially if there's a framing and there is a space that you can create. And so this is also getting back into some of the things that we talked about yesterday, which is around how can you also create space, and how can you be a leader even in a small way to create opportunities for people to step outside of their usual day to day. And so this does connect to Adi's comment here a little bit, where thank you for the clarification, real life case of LCP. I think part of it is also by being able to use the LCP, you're also starting to understand, even if you're not a manager, even if you're not an executive, what kind of leadership can you embody in the space that you do have to hold others and to enable that energy that you bring for others to play within. Um, One example of the LCP for you, Adi, is that Insight Pact for the last few years has worked with UNHCR, the Refugee Agency of the United Nations, on their Innovation Fellowship Program. And this fellowship program brings dozens of individuals from across the globe who work at UNHCR to learn innovation techniques. And not all of them are managers. They come from security, they come from program development, they come from protection, all sorts of areas where maybe they wouldn't be called a leader by their roles and responsibilities or their job title. But part of the program is making sure that everyone understands that they do have an opportunity to understand where they fit into the system, or where they'd like to see themselves fit into the system. And part of that begins with observing themselves and to look at themselves from a more holistic perspective and how they can navigate these complex systems in humanitarian crisis environments, to be able to take those moments of leadership and introduce something a little bit different, a little bit new, or as we've been saying, to bring back some of the elements that we have known as children, and to bring them back into a space where they will be useful. Because especially in a organization such as the UN, which is very bureaucratic in many ways, being able to innovate means to simply do something a little bit different than what everyone is doing day to day, just to see if it might make a shift in efficiency or idea generation or delivery. Uh, and the whole point actually of the innovation fellowship, it's quite a great example, because it's been going on for more than 8 years at this point, and they're playing the long game in terms of giving a lot of people an opportunity to say, hey, I can bring myself to introduce new tools that get people to get up and do a little bit of body work, do a little bit of emotional reflection within a space that maybe historically isn't so open about these kinds of small experiments in the day to day. Maybe Beth, you have another case for the LCP that you can share as well.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier working with scientists in Indonesia on their ability to be collaborative. The Packard Foundation gave a grant that resulted in something called the Science Leadership Collaborative. And that took a cohort of scientists from across Indonesia, and some of them not in Indonesia, but Indonesian, in a year-long process of exploring how they could shift their ability to collaborate. And in that program, one of the processes they went through was doing the leadership circle. And it's not, the leadership circle is nice because it kind of fits with this holistic view, but it's not the only assessment tool that will give people an aha. But in this particular case, what we noticed was that the women who were in this program, many of them had had very difficult situations in their journey to become scientists. They had had to go across some cultural stereotypes. They had to push back on some beliefs about their ability to deliver in the space of science or to be leaders in that space. And so what many of them discovered by doing the leadership circle, or just by doing this kind of self-inquiry, whether it's the leadership circle or not, was how many of the behaviors that they had engaged in were protective. And they suddenly realized that perhaps they were now in a place where they could relax that need to contract and to protect themselves, and they could be a bit more creative and a bit more expansive. And they really had some revelatory experiences. They really suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I'm acting out of a lot of assumptions I've had, or I'm acting out of my past experiences, but that might not be true anymore. So they were able to open up new ways of seeing what was possible for them. And the guy who did the debriefs was completely transformed. So I think, and that's what we have the paper about, is that experience of them having that process of looking at. So I'll try to find the paper and give it to Hermes or one of the folks in the organization in case anybody wants to see it. But it's just that kind of waking up and then saying, oh, wow, okay, that thing that I've beaten myself up about, maybe I don't need to do that anymore. And if you're able to do the 360, sometimes the wake up is, oh, wow, you know, I think of myself as being really high in integrity, but my team doesn't think so. So now I have an ability to say, I think I better inquire into the system to find out what's creating that discrepancy in the perception. And this leadership circle is just one tool that does that for us. If maybe for another session, we can go into talking about the tools of complexity science and how they're trying to get us to look at things from different points of view and to look at data in more holistic and intuitive ways as well. So I think that's the real message for me is, as leaders, we want to bring ourselves as whole human beings into our workspaces, and we want to create environments in which the people who are working with us can bring their whole selves in, and that we support them to be able to have access to all of these ways of knowing and these ways of thinking about how we're going to solve some very wicked and intractable problems in our organizations. End of sermon.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. I know that we're definitely coming up to time here, so I do want to make sure that we're beginning to wrap up and saying a couple of thank yous to all of our attendees for today, our participants. And thank you so much for making the time out of your day today. And of course, to Beth for your insights and your sharings from your own life and your professional experience working with your clients and partners around the world. It's been really, really wonderful to have you here. And truly, it's what we just stepped into in this conversation is very complex. There's a lot more to dive into. So the invitation to everyone here is to continue the conversation, is to reach out to anyone at Insight Pact, and we're happy to connect you to Beth for a conversation, or we're happy to continue the conversation as well, and to continue to look out for opportunities for us to practice. Because I think actually the irony of us having this conversation, just talking for an hour, is really not the point of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, which is to step in, literally step in to the practice of embodiment, of understanding how we exist, literally, physically, mentally, holistically, we exist in systems that aren't in the computer screen. Like, even, right? The whole idea here that even though I'm talking to you through the computer, I'm still physically here in relation to an object as well. So there's a lot more to unpack. And we're going to be definitely offering both at Insight Pact together with future considerations and Beth opportunities to practice some of the tools and methodologies and approaches that we've talked about here today. So I hope to see you then when we offer those again. And I hope to see you all tomorrow for our third webinar with Trishul Galani from Beti Beta, who will be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in Asia. And with that, I'd like to close this webinar and give a big thank you again to Beth and all of you for making the time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.